I was offered the car for 6,000 yuan, and to be honest, I couldn't help but chuckle at first. The seller claimed the little car weighed so much, but I was skeptical. It couldn't have been more than a few hundred kilograms. Still, my curiosity got the better of me when the seller sent me a video of the car's condition. From the outside, it didn't seem too bad. Everything essential appeared to be there, and nothing seemed blatantly out of place or missing. It was only when the camera panned to the interior that the reality of the situation hit me. The inside was a chaotic mess, filthy, and looked like it had been abandoned for years. But stepping back to assess the overall condition, I realized it was still salvageable. Sure, it wasn't pristine, but it wasn't a complete disaster either. Both the exterior and interior showed potential, and all the major components seemed intact. 6,000 yuan for a quirky little car from the 1980s, I thought. That's worth the risk. Without much hesitation, I went ahead and bought it. Once the deal was done, I figured it'd be a good idea to bring it home properly. Spending a little extra to hire a tow truck was a no-brainer. It was worth it to avoid any unnecessary risks during transportation. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally arrived at my workshop. And here's where things got interesting. It wasn't that the car was missing an engine. It had one, but it was stored in the trunk. This Fiat 126P is a rear-wheel drive car, so the engine's natural placement is in the back. However, as I opened the trunk, my initial excitement quickly faded. The engine was completely covered in rust, thick, unrelenting rust that made my heart sink. My first thought was, had this car been submerged in a flood? Or maybe it had spent years forgotten in a damp, musty corner where moisture slowly worked its destructive magic. To make matters worse, the trunk latch was broken and wouldn't close properly. As I started inspecting the rest of the car, I discovered a mix of good and bad news. One side still had its original lights, license plate holder, and emblem intact, which gave me a glimmer of hope. But the other side told a different story. The light was aftermarket, a clear sign of past repairs and possibly poor ones at that. Moving on to the doors, things only got worse. The lower edges were severely corroded, validating my suspicion that the car had been stored in a poorly ventilated, humid environment for years. The chassis and lower panels were riddled with rust, and the doors themselves were warped and misaligned. Inside, the situation wasn't any better. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. The locks were completely useless, and the warped doors wouldn't even close properly. Still, there were small victories. The front of the car retained its original turn signals, and the headlights were surprisingly intact. But my optimism was short-lived when I noticed the hood. A massive hole surrounded by rust had eaten its way through the metal. It looked like the car had been left to rot under the worst conditions imaginable. At this point, I had to stop and ask myself, what's the best way to move forward with this car? I could probably find a better condition Fiat 126P for a little more money, but this one was already here. Fully dismantling it and restoring each piece felt like a monumental task, yet the idea of abandoning it didn't sit right with me. This car had a story, and I wanted to be the one to give it a second chance. With the car now in my workshop, the first task was clear: get the engine running. If the engine could be salvaged, the rest of the restoration would feel more manageable. However, as I inspected it more closely, the situation looked grim. The engine's surface was completely rusted, and the spark plugs were beyond saving. They would need immediate replacement. Despite the state of things, I couldn't shake the hope that the engine might still have some life left. I poured oil into the cylinders to lubricate them and tried turning the engine over. Nothing. The engine was completely seized, likely with the pistons stuck in place. Determined but slightly deflated, I turned my attention to the car's underside. The structural integrity was in shambles. Rust, holes, and cracks riddled the chassis. Welding was going to be absolutely necessary. As I dismantled more components, the extent of the damage became painfully clear. The oil pan cover had a massive hole, though surprisingly, the oil inside was clean and free of water contamination. A small mercy. Surrounding parts, however, were rusted and filled with debris. It felt like uncovering a time capsule, one that had been buried in the worst possible conditions. Piece by piece, I began removing the car's components. Each removal uncovered new layers of rust, grime, and decay. The cylinders were no exception. Rust had taken over here too. At this point, I stopped trying to figure out what had caused it all. The reasons didn't matter anymore. What mattered was whether I could bring this car back to life. It was hard not to feel a little hopeless, but I had already made up my mind. This Fiat 126P wasn't going to end up as scrap metal. It had been neglected for too long, and now it was my turn to give it a new chapter. No matter how daunting the task ahead, I was ready to take it on, piece by piece. After relentless effort and countless hours of work, I finally managed to completely dismantle the engine of this car. There was a glimmer of relief in discovering that the crankshaft bearings were still in good condition, and the cylinders didn't appear to have sustained any major damage. However, the process wasn't without its setbacks. While removing the piston rings, I accidentally broke them, which means I'll now need to purchase a completely new set. It's a frustrating development, but not an unexpected one. When I took a closer look at the engine, the problem became crystal clear. Every moving part, every mechanism that should have rotated smoothly was completely seized with rust. This, without a doubt, was the primary reason why the engine wouldn't turn over. The past few days have been utterly exhausting, both mentally and physically. I've been so consumed by this project that I haven't had a proper night's sleep in ages. My eyes are swollen, my energy levels are drained, and I feel like I'm running on fumes. Restoring an old car may seem like an exciting and glamorous endeavor in theory, but the reality is anything but. It's a grueling, tedious process that often keeps you awake at night, obsessively thinking about how to tackle the next problem. Right now, I feel utterly worn out. The engine was already in terrible shape, and now I've discovered that the generator is also damaged beyond use. Can these problems be fixed? Absolutely. But will it be a painstakingly long and frustrating process? Without a doubt. I bought this Fiat 126P, a quirky gem from the 1980s, for what seemed like a bargain. 6,000 yuan. At the time, I convinced myself that I had landed an incredible deal, something I couldn't pass up. But as soon as I got it back home and took my first real look at it, reality hit hard. The engine wouldn't budge no matter what I tried. At that moment, I thought I had identified the car's biggest issue, but I was wrong, very wrong. Once I got the car up on a lift and inspected the underside, I was met with a nightmare. The chassis was severely corroded, with rust eating away at critical structural areas. What I had thought was a treasure had quickly turned into a source of endless headaches. But my stubborn nature wouldn't let me back down from the challenge. I was determined to see this project through. Removing the engine proved to be a monumental task. It fought me every step of the way, and the surprises didn't stop there. Once I had it out and took a closer look, I realized that every single part was covered in rust. Anything that was meant to move was frozen solid. There was no other choice but to completely dismantle the engine, part by part. It was slow, meticulous work, and once everything was disassembled, the long process of cleaning, lubricating, and restoring each component began. It felt like an eternity, but eventually the engine was fully dismantled, laying bare all the work that lay ahead. The next phase was clear: cleaning, repairing, and maintaining every part. Take the valves, for example. They were completely coated in thick, baked-on carbon deposits. There was no way this engine could ever run in such a condition. I carefully cleaned each valve, removing layer after layer of grime. But as one problem was solved, another would emerge. This is the reality of restoring an old car. It's a never-ending cycle of fixes that constantly test your patience. One particularly frustrating moment came when I encountered a broken screw lodged in the cylinder head. There was no easy way to remove it, so I resorted to one of my ultimate tricks. Using a welding technique, I painstakingly attached a nut to the broken screw and worked it out millimeter by millimeter. After over an hour of effort, I finally succeeded. From there, I polished the valves and prepared everything for reassembly. Let's not forget the oil pan. It was in such bad shape that it had massive holes in it, rendering it nearly unusable. My only option was to grind it clean, patch up the damaged areas, and weld it back together. The process was tedious and took the better part of a day, but in the end, I managed to restore it to a functional state. Next, I moved on to the starter motor. It had been sitting idle for so many years that I couldn't be sure it would even work. To be safe, I completely disassembled it, cleaned every part, and reassembled it with proper maintenance. This has been my life for the past several days: repairing the starter motor, restoring the carburetor, fixing the transmission, and dealing with every new issue that pops up along the way. It's a constant back-and-forth process of disassembling, repairing, and reassembling. To my surprise and relief, the transmission was in relatively good shape, a small victory that felt like a big win after all the setbacks. If you look at my workbench now, it's covered with engine parts, each meticulously labeled and organized. This is my first time working on a Fiat 126P engine, and I was initially worried about whether I'd be able to put everything back together correctly. To make things easier, I took the time to label every component and note its placement, ensuring that nothing would get lost or misplaced. Restoring an old car is filled with unexpected twists and turns, but that's part of its charm. It's a journey that tests your patience, determination, and problem-solving skills at every turn. Despite the endless surprises and setbacks, I've come this far, and there's no turning back now. My goal is clear: to bring this little Fiat 126P back to life and give it a new lease on the road. The journey ahead will undoubtedly be long, but I'm ready to face every challenge that comes my way. This car's story isn't over yet. It's just beginning. After carefully cleaning and restoring all the parts, I meticulously arranged them in order, ensuring that nothing would get misplaced during reassembly. Organization is key when working on a project like this, and especially with an engine that's been completely dismantled. Each piece was laid out, labeled, and prepped, ready for the next step. With everything in place, it was time to pick up the pace and begin reassembling the engine. One of the highlights of this restoration journey came recently when I got my hands on a brand new set of piston rings for the 3S 16P engine. These rings are like gold for a project like this, essential for breathing life back into the engine. With them installed, I finally felt that this engine had a real chance of running again. It was a small victory, but one that filled me with hope and renewed motivation to keep pushing forward. Fixing this car has been a journey full of obstacles and unexpected challenges. One of the most frustrating tasks was dealing with the ball joint bushings. Old cars like this Fiat 126P make sourcing replacement parts incredibly difficult. I spent days searching for a solution and faced setback after setback, but perseverance paid off and I finally resolved the issue. Without wasting more time, I got straight to installing it, eager to see the results. With everything back in place, the moment of truth arrived. It was time to test the engine. I held my breath, crossed my fingers, and gave it a go. The engine roared to life. Hearing that sound was one of the most rewarding moments of this entire restoration process. It wasn't perfect, though. The engine shook a little too much, so I quickly added a cushion underneath to stabilize it. With that small adjustment, it ran smoothly and steadily. That feeling of accomplishment, of seeing all the hard work come together, is why I love doing this. But this was just one step in a much larger journey. The engine was finally running, but the rest of the car still needed a complete restoration. Every panel, every component would need attention. This Fiat 126P from the 1980s, which I initially thought was a bargain at 6,000 yuan, turned out to be far more work than I had anticipated. When I first bought it, I was thrilled, convinced I'd stumbled upon a hidden gem. But as soon as I got it home, reality hit me hard. The engine was seized, refusing to turn over, and the bodywork was in much worse condition than I'd imagined. The deeper I dove into the project, the more problems I uncovered. Despite the setbacks, I refused to give up. I poured every ounce of effort into cleaning and restoring the rusted engine until it was back in working condition. That sense of triumph was short-lived, though, as another major issue came to light. The chassis was severely corroded. At this stage, there was no turning back. I committed myself to the challenge and began dismantling every part of the chassis, cleaning, repairing, and welding the damaged areas as needed. The rust on the chassis components was worse than I had feared. It had eaten through vital sections, leaving no choice but to bring out my ultimate technique, using a blowtorch to burn off the rust and prepare the parts for repair. While working on the chassis, I stumbled upon another big problem. The lower control arm was broken. Seeing the extent of the damage left me momentarily discouraged. This wasn't a simple fix. How was I going to repair something so critical and so specific? Many of you have commented saying, "Don't dwell on the challenges, we're here to see your success." And you're absolutely right. Your support and encouragement have been my driving force. So I set my worries aside, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. The key is to tackle one problem at a time, no matter how daunting it seems. Challenges like these are just opportunities to think creatively and push forward. Here's the lower control arm I removed, along with part of the 16P suspension system. Upon closer inspection, I found a massive hole in one section and severe deformation in another. For most parts, I can usually find a way to repair or replace them. But this component was particularly tricky. Its unique 12-inch size and specific dimensions made finding a replacement almost impossible. Some of you suggested looking at parts from similar compact vans, but the width and bolt spacing didn't match. This left me with only one option: welding it back together. Restoring this piece to its original condition will be challenging, but it's also the kind of work that brings the most satisfaction when done right. With no time to waste, I dove into the repairs. I put on an upbeat playlist to keep my energy up and started working on the welding and shaping process. Slowly but surely, I began making progress. It's a long road, but with each step, the car starts to come together. Seeing the transformation happen piece by piece keeps me motivated, even when the work feels overwhelming. Restoring this Fiat 126P isn't just about fixing a car. It's about breathing new life into a piece of history. It's about taking something forgotten and neglected and giving it a second chance. I can't wait to see this project completed. Watching this car roll out of the workshop, ready for its next chapter, will make every hour of hard work worth it. This journey is far from over, but I'm ready to face whatever challenges lie ahead. Together, we'll bring this little Fiat 126P back to life. We moved everything onto the lathe to carefully process the parts, clean them thoroughly, and prepare them for reassembly. At the same time, the entire car is undergoing a full sandblasting treatment, followed by deep deodorizing to remove years of accumulated grime and unpleasant odors. This step is critical to breathing new life into this worn-out vehicle.